All right, I have 11:03 on my clock, so let's get back into it. I hope you all had a lovely second breakout room session and you are excited for our third and final session of the day where we are going to be talking about grazing cover crops again. And so to do that, I'm going to introduce our two speakers. First, we will have Mary Drewnoski, who's an associate professor at the University of Nebraska Lincoln in the Department of Animal Science, and she researches integrating crop and livestock systems. And then Zack Smith will follow, and Zack farms in Winnebago County, Iowa, where he's been using cover crops since 2014. And Zack and a business partner have come up with a pretty innovative way to couple crops and livestock, which I'll let him tell you all about when it's his turn. So Mary, you can unmute and get us started.
Okay, so today I'm actually going to talk about using cover crops for growing calves. It's actually one of the things that we do actually out at our research facility in Mead, Nebraska. So that's eastern Nebraska. And we kind of pair cover crops, crop residue together. And so we kind of have fall grazing with cover crops. We have crop residue during the winter and then spring grazing. Again with cover crops. And so I think there's a great opportunity here for taking those weaned calves in October and November and being able to add value to them. Okay, next slide. So what we're really talking about is the opportunity to kind of target grazing in this September, October, November, December time period, and then also like April, May time period. And I want to be clear, I'm going to talk really about crops that you could plant August 1 to September 1 for fall grazing, or if you can't get it in until after September 1st, really you probably got to go with something that's winter hardy and plan on mainly spring grazing. So next slide. So for that, something that you can plant in that summertime period, that August to September, I really like oats and rapeseed. There are other options, but I think this really works well. So one of the things, rapeseed's not familiar with a lot of people. It is a brassica. It's like a turnip, so like purple top turnip, but it doesn't produce a bulb. It actually produces a taproot. And one of the things I like about that is that it puts more of its energy into producing leaf. And I can manage the grazing a little bit better because if I use the purple top and I want them to actually use that dry matter or that biomass that gets produced in that bulb, I have less ability to maintain soil cover. But with rapeseed added into a mix with oats, I can really manage how much ground cover I leave. I can get a nice taproot, help with some compaction, and I can get some really valuable feed. Next slide. So I want to be clear, timing is really, really important, and people underestimate how much difference there is really just in 2 weeks in the fall in terms of how much growth you can get. And so I have on here the amount of biomass we got from oats when we planted them side by side in the same field, but we either planted them on September 3rd or on September 17th. And you can see it's night and day the amount of forage production. We basically got 1.5 tons if we could plant it September 3rd after early harvested corn silage, or when we took high moisture corn off of that same field, just a little bit different component of the field, we only got 500 pounds, which was maybe like 3 inches. So night and day. If you can't get it in by the first week of September, it's time to go with something that's winter hardy. Next slide, please. So I talked about, I like oats and rapeseed, and there's a couple reasons why I like oats and rapeseed. One of which is I'm cheap and I like things that are cheap. So 50 pounds of oats plus 3 pounds of rapeseed will give me the same biomass or yield as 100 pounds of oats in a side-by-side comparison. And over 2 years with 600 calves, we found that the oat rapeseed mix actually gives us a little bit better gain. So I have 2.11 pounds per day with the oats and rapeseed compared to just the monoculture of oats, and we only get about 1.95. Not a huge difference, but when I tell you that the oats and rapeseed cost me $15 an acre in seed cost versus about 20 to 23 for the monoculture of oats, to me it's a no-brainer. It's kind of a win-win. All right, next slide, please. One of the things that I think people underestimate, and I did. I actually thought we would lose a lot more forage quality than we do after the frost. So with these late summer planted oats and brassicas, they really maintain their quality quite well into the winter. Even when they turn brown and ugly, you can see this picture on December 9th. I mean, that looks like the forage quality would be really low. But in fact, if you look at that TDN value, I bet it's better than probably any hay that you have. So it's really high energy going into the fall, and it maintains it quite well. And you can see that it's got protein content that's probably just as good, if not better than alfalfa hay. Next slide, please. So gains on calves, we get some variation. So 2 pounds to 1.3. Can you hit the next button, please? But we do get some variation, and that's really due to year. It seems like it's not really quality of the forage so much as weather. 2015 was a particularly wet winter. We got a lot of precipitation events. I think when those calves were out over a 70-day period, we got about 6 different precipitation events where they got a wet hair coat. And so they just used a lot of energy to stay warm. When they have a wet hair coat, 50 degrees is the temperature where they have to start using energy to maintain their body temperature. And so basically, if they're wet, they got to start using. So in this case, you can see there's quite a bit of variation, but 2 pound a day is kind of what we get on average. Next slide, please. In terms of the amount of grazing, that also is quite variable. So I have AUMs per acre on here, which is basically, think of that as like 1,000-pound cow per acre is what we get the equivalent of for 1 AUM. Again, the variability has a little bit to do with the amount of forage, but also we set stock in this system. We just put out about a calf an acre, and we graze until we don't have any more forage left. We get usually 60 to 90 days worth of grazing, and how variable it is really depends again on weather. If we get some precipitation events, particularly if the temperature gets a little bit warmer and we don't have a frozen ground, we trample a lot more in. So still 1.3, 1.4 AUMs per acre, or the equivalent to about 2 calves for a month an acre. That's pretty good. Next slide, please. Costs are variable, and I have on here just kind of the costs that we had going into many of these different systems, and it ranges quite a bit. So seed cost is one of the big variables. We can charge anywhere from 12 bucks to 20 bucks an acre we have in it typically, and you can get more if you get into some of the fancier mixes. But I'll tell you, the big thing that I've learned is that if I plant later, probably anything after about the 15th of August, I don't see a lot of return for putting on nitrogen, and so we've stopped doing that. If I do plant early, like at 1st of August, after wheat, then I do put on nitrogen, and I think I get my value out of it. Next slide, please. So the cost of gains, again, would be variable because our costs going in was variable, but look at those costs of gains. I mean, they look pretty good. On average, 54 cents per pound of gain. That's pretty hard to do. And, we had 2 years there where it's a little high, about $1 to 84 cents. And one of those was a situation where we had low gains because of the wetter weather and we had high trampling. And then the other one was he ended up pulling off because of ice, and we didn't put calves back out, but we actually did take cows in and graze it off way late into the winter. And I don't have that value added in there. And so that's one of the things you have to think about is you got to have some ability to be adaptable in your system. We could have fed hay or done something out there, but we decided to move them off. Next slide, please. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is we can do that grazing. We can get 60 to 90 days. We may go to stocks, feed some distillers, and then we still have those calves going into the spring. And if we want to get them till time we could turn them out on grass or sell them to the grass market, then using a winter hardy species like cereal rye, winter wheat, or triticale really makes a lot of sense. And I'll tell you, if you can keep it vegetative, we can keep high quality, and we don't really see from a protein standpoint a lot of advantage for grazing with the hairy vetch added in. I have on here the difference between Elbon rye and a variety non-stated rye, which tends to be northern rye for us when we get VNS. And you can see a same planting date, the same time in the spring. Elbon comes on a little bit earlier because it is a southern rye, so it comes out of dormancy earlier. We get a little bit more yield earlier. And so if you're looking for something really early, Elbon might make sense unless you're in really far north. And then it might actually get damaged because it comes out maybe a little bit too early. Next slide, please. So planting date does matter in terms of how much yield you get. And for most of Nebraska, we basically start getting declining yields in the spring if we plant after September 18th. You can hit the next button. And what we see is that we'd still get declining after that date. But honestly, I mean, look at October 10th, we're still at 80% of the yield potential in the spring. So it looks pretty good. We can still get reasonable yields in planting in November, but it is a little slower to get started in the spring. So you can't get on it. So it's not as great if you're trying to work in that early spring grazing to get off to move to something else in that field, like planting corn or soybeans. Next slide, please. So this is a comparison we did looking at the difference between cereal rye, triticale, and wheat. And I will tell you that if you keep it vegetative, so we start grazing when it's 5 inches and we stock heavy. So my target is typically about the equivalent of 2 calves an acre. And I'd like to have 3 rotations, so ability to go to 3 different fields and rotate between them so I can keep my grass between 5 inches and 2 inches, and then we can get really high gains. So that's almost 4 pound a day gains. Don't really see a lot of difference between the species other than the fact that rye comes on and we can actually get started. This is not an Elbon rye in this one, and we still started a week earlier on grazing than the triticale and the wheat. Gain per acre is really, really high. Go to the next slide. And we see cost of gains are quite low. And so this was what our actual was about 18, 19 cents per pound of gain. The one thing that we did have was those calves on stocks. We didn't supplement them very much. We only gained about a pound a day. And so we did have some compensation. So they grew a little better. So if you didn't have that situation, we probably would have got about 3 pound a day gain and would have been a little bit higher cost of gain, but still really good. Next slide, please. And so this is actually, I saw Kerry Knuth was on. This is actually the gains that we got grazing some calves on some of his fields with Elbon rye. So even Elbon rye can give you really high rates of gain if you can keep it vegetative. Next slide, please. So that's really all I had. And then we can talk about what questions you have after we get through with Zack, I guess.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you, Mary. So any questions for Mary can continue to be put into the chat box, and then Zack, I will let you start presenting and sharing your screen. Thank you, Mary.
Okay, can you see and hear me?
Looks good, yes.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll get started. So my name is Zack Smith, and I'm from Lake Mills, Iowa. And I actually farm about 15 miles west of my hometown of Buffalo Center. And I was asked to come to Cover Crop Boot Camp today to talk about my experiences with a project that kind of did a prototype testing this summer on called the STOCKCROPPER. And so this system is kind of based around a mob grazing concept, and I will be the first one to put the disclaimer out that I am not a expert when it comes to livestock or grazing. This was my first take. I am a row crop guy, corn soybean farmer. So I learned a lot this year about this, and I'm probably more excited to show this idea to the folks on this session today and get feedback from you. So I'm looking forward to that. And the other fun thing for me is about 18 years ago, I was actually an intern at the Leopold Center at Iowa State and worked with Gary Huber and Rich Pirog back then on the pork niche market working group. And so it's fun to come full circle from 18 years ago back to PFI to share this story. So the stock cropper, or this project, which I'll get into details of what it is, was really the genesis of two middle-aged 41-year-old farmers, kind of with a midlife crisis on the direction of their farm and where they thought the future was going. So that's me on the left, and my partner and friend Sheldon Stevermer on the right. So we're, like I said, two 41-year-old farmers that have had a friendship for the last 10 years. It's been kind of centered around soil health and soil conservation. So we're both strip tillers. I've had cover crops on my farm since 2014 and experience with that. But we've really been interested in, as small farmers, trying to find innovative ways to add more profitability by doing things a little bit differently and more efficiently on our operations. And so I kind of culminated this last winter when corn prices were, essentially $3 a bushel, and we had $8 beans, and we were really struggling trying to find an alternative path to profitability versus just farming normally like we had. And so we played a lot with this concept around strip intercropping for the last 8 to 10 years in different variations, 60-inch corn, cover crops in between. We could never really find a combination that we thought was realistic to put out on widespread adoption across our acres, until we were brainstorming with another friend who suggested, well, instead of doing crops in that system with strip intercropping, why not try to put livestock in between your strips of corn? And so that idea was hatched in February, and we sat down for the next about a month on the whiteboard and tried to come up with a bunch of different iterations and ideas of how this could work. And we ended up launching this concept here in June. So what is stock cropping? We define it, and I'll give you my 15-second elevator pitch. Stock cropping is the intersection and cross leveraging of livestock and row crops together in the field, happening dynamically at the same time. So, basically what we're doing is turning back the play clock 100 years to our grandfathers and great grandfathers with how they did things a lot differently than what we do in conventional agriculture today, to try to work both of these systems off of each other more dynamically. So as you can see in this picture, our setup was we had row crop corn in 12-row strips next to 20-foot strips of annual pasture. And in order to try to put livestock with that, we had to come up with a way to confine them. And so we designed and manufactured and built ourselves this mobile barn unit here that we affectionately call the Cluster Cluck 5000. You got to be careful with how you say that. And this little beauty moved 11 feet a day through the advancement of a winch that we used this first year. And eventually by the end of the summer, we actually got electric battery powered advancement on our motors, or on the wheel drives that you can see on the outside, so that we were able to move, give the animals fresh pasture every day. So we had sheep and chickens out front, or I'm sorry, not sheep and chickens, sheep and goats out front, followed by pigs. Those were housed in the barn structure there with water and additional feed. And then we had 2 chicken tractors that followed behind. So the idea here was we wanted to have a multitude of biodiversity. If you look around most corn and soybean fields, it's just corn and soybeans. And, every once in a while you might see a field that has a cover crop. Well, we wanted to, the whole purpose was just to kind of go overboard on putting a lot of different livestock and species out there. So we had 4 different species of livestock. We had, I think, 6 or 7 different species of plants in the system. And the thing that we're really excited about with this idea is the self-sufficiency and nutrient cycling of what we're doing here. So the idea is that we want to have row crops in the field that are grown specifically for the purpose of becoming the feedstuffs the following year for the animals the following year. So we would take directly off, process it ourselves, and feed it back to the animals. On the flip side, the animals move through the strips and lay down just a plethora of really biodiverse manure to build the fertility, interact with the soil biology, and make for a really, really rich place to rotate and flip the following year and plant the row crops into that. So you get kind of a perfect, regenerative circle of cycling. And the idea is that we walk the value off the farm in a non-commodity form. That was really our goal, not to have commodity number 2 corn to sell, but a pasture-raised animal that we could market directly to consumers. So that's kind of the system in a nutshell. So this is what it looked like. This is an above ground or a drone shot that we took. So we had several strips of corn that you can see. that we managed for high production intercrop corn. And then in between, we had 3 strips of pasture. So this was a picture from the middle of August. So you can see the progression of the barn. It was really dry here. So our regrowth coming out of August was pretty poor. So this looks kind of bad, but I'll show some pictures here later that shows what it ended up looking like at the end of the fall. But essentially what we did here is we started grazing in the center strip. We progressed down, came down the east alley, and then back to the west. And we actually finished up this alley into the first part of October. So it took about a month to move down the alleys until we got to the third one, where the animals were big enough that we needed to move them twice a day instead of just once a day. And so that was one of the lessons that we learned, that movement becomes important throughout the season. So the grazing stuff that I'm supposed to talk about today. So what was our strategy? We had no idea what we were doing when we started this, because we'd never set out with a project. So I had to sit down and get help from Margaret Smith at the Albert Lee Seed House, who's a name I think a lot of people on here know. And I kind of told her this crazy concept we had, and she gave her best shot at trying to give us a mix that would check a lot of the boxes, to have things that would get started early with cool season species, and then have stuff that would hopefully come back later as well after the animals passed over. But our goal was to have a mix that would be able to be grazed by sheep and goats, pigs, and then chickens, and then be able to come back to have regrowth to hold the nutrients that were laid by the manure there, so that they would not leach in the tile or anything like that, and really achieve our goals of being a more sustainable system. And then also open up the potential for a second pass of grazing, which we actually did accomplish. We got enough regrowth on our first pass, we were able to graze it a second time. So the mix that we led with, or that she set me up with, was a mix of annual rye, Sudan grass, 2 bushels of oats, forage rape, and field peas. And so we went out and planted this across all 3 of our pasture runs, hoping that this would sustain us throughout the year. So this is what that looked like. I think this was about the end of April. We drilled this in with a Hinneker drill that I have, and then we strip tilled our corn on corn in between. I put about 50 pounds of nitrogen on this to get this to green up nice, and it took off really well the spring we had. So this is what it looked like when we launched the cluster cluck on the 14th of June. We had a mix that was primarily dominated by the oats in the mix, and we did have some of the forage rape and the field peas that came up. And this first run here, it took us about 30 days to get through, and it really, really worked well. We had a really, really nice mix that the ruminant animals really, really enjoyed. It was really fun. Every morning we'd move it, and they'd come out, and it was like Christmas for them. They'd go nuts grazing this down, and then the pigs would come after, and then the chickens after that. The problem we ran into, though, was thinking that the oats would eventually mature. We were hoping the mix underneath would take off, and what we found was the oats dominated it so much we had very little that was coming underneath. So we ended up coming back, and under the advice of a couple people, we decided to mow the oats off to try to open the canopy up so that the other species that were supposed to come later and would actually take off and come through, so we could have some viable pasture when we went further into the summer. And it never wanted to rain, so that really didn't work out. We ended up with something looking like this in our July pasture run, where we had basically just oat residue left and not a lot of vegetation. So we ended up coming in and seeding some additional sorghum, Sudan grass, and cowpeas in the first week of July to try to get things jump started. And so our second pasture run in July, we did not have a lot of vegetation. It kind of sucked, to be honest with you. So we ended up supplementing with some grass hay for the ruminants to keep them going, and then just kept the parade of the animals moving through to get the nutrient deposition that we wanted. And then in August, we did catch a couple rains for our third run that had the Sudan and the cowpeas to take off, and we had some better grazing to finish with. So this slide is actually would go back to, let's see, this one here. This was our first pasture run. So after passing through that, this is what the regrowth looked like, I think, about the first part of August. So we started to get some of the other species coming back, and you can see kind of that linear decline as it goes in time across here, but this actually grew up enough where when we came back in September, some of the stuff was, as tall as the corn, so 8 to 10 feet tall, and the animals really liked finishing on that. So on the strips that were grazed late, down, to about the ground, we did get some nice regrowth. So our goal of holding nutrients through the fall and having a living root in there, it worked out for us. You can see here the corn at maturity, and this is me actually harvesting the corn. I had a lot of questions from people as far as how our corn did in this system, and corn and intercrop production can be extremely good. This was corn, third year corn on corn, and it was like 260 bushel an acre corn on less than 20 inches of rain this year for us. So we were happy with how that turned out as well. So what did I learn from this stuff? We didn't hatch this idea until February. So in a perfect world, just like the previous presenter was talking about, I'd want to get started earlier to extend my grazing season. So getting fall establishment, set earlier so that we can, start in the middle of May versus the middle of June like we did. So I want to come up with a plan to do that. And I actually have already got cereal rye seeded on my site for next year. And we may do some additional seeding here this next week to get some other species out when we get our plans a little bit better laid down. So we will have multiple, species plans for the different periods of time, and probably multiple planting dates as we go into spring. And we're also entertaining the idea of doing some relay cropping on potentially the later grazing, where we can maybe harvest something early, establish the pasture to try to get more value out of the system that way. The other thing that we had pitched to us was the idea of reseeding off of the back of the barn to make sure that we do, if we graze intensely like we're doing, that we make sure that we've got a good catch there to make sure that we stay green all the way through fall after the animals do their thing. Some of the challenges that we're going to have to improve on, a lot of people said, your pigs are going to get out, you're going to have a disaster with rooting. And we never lost an animal. We didn't have one animal escape the system, but pig rooting was a problem. And I want to move next year to figure out how to ring pigs successfully. We tried it and we weren't any good at it. The rings fell out within a week. So we're going to have to get better at that for next year, so we don't have such a rough finish to our field, because we do want to come back and row crop that the next year, and you can't have big pig wallows when you're trying to run a corn planter through it. So the other piece is, you could see in our pictures, we didn't have a lot of vegetation for our chickens. So we're going to maybe try to do some switching around with the order where we put the chickens. We may run them in a strip themselves, so they have plenty of vegetation. And then we're going to work on the technology on the barn to work on the variable speed movement throughout space and time throughout the summer, because we know the bigger the animals got, we had to speed the barn up and move it more. So we're looking at integration of solar and guidance so that the barn can move through the strips, and try to automate that more, so we're not having to manually advance that with a winch or a tractor or something like that. So as far as where we're moving for 2021 with this project, we're looking, probably an additional 4 stock cropper barns that we're going to build this winter. We're going to be testing various configurations along with different sets of animals. We've had a lot of interest for people wanting a cattle option in there. So that's something that we're going to look to try to figure out how cattle would work in the system. Like I said, multiple grazing programs, relay cropping, and then this idea of coming up with a row crop combination that can be a complete feed stuff. So one of the ideas we're looking at is, instead of just corn, splitting our row crop mix up between corn and potentially field peas, so that we could harvest that and then make our own feed ration accordingly. So I think that's probably time. I'm probably over because I usually talk too much, but this is my final slide. We've got a lot of stuff on social media. If you're really curious about the story and you want to see everything throughout the season, our YouTube channel, the Stock Cropper, has got it all documented, including our field day. And Facebook, we live streamed every night from the barn so that people could see the animals. Insta, Twitter, all that stuff's there. And I'll happily go into Q&A now.
Great. Thank you, Zach and Mary. That was awesome. We are getting some questions, so I will try and field those back and forth to you. Mary, it looks like you answered some of these in the chat box, but I want to make sure everyone hears them. There was a question about what species to plant after a small grain harvest, like wheat or something in late July or early August. Can you talk a little bit about that and then how that interacts with fertilizer that you said? So is it oats and rapeseed or something else?
Yeah, so if you can get it in July and you're looking for tonnage, then warm seasons like sorghum Sudan or pearl millet make a lot of sense. One of the things that we've been actually struggling with is when's the date, like to think about switching. But it really depends on your goals. If I'm looking for really high quality, we actually sometimes delay planting until August 1st so we can plant oats. If you plant oats too early, they actually try to go mature and they don't put on much yield and they just put out a head. So like July 25th is too early for us to put oats in the mix without just getting straw. But after that period, then oats make a lot of sense and we can get good quality. If I'm planting really early, like August 1st, I like going and getting a forage type oat because they're later maturing and so they maintain quality better. But if you're looking for tonnage and like you want to feed dry cows, or you want to be able to just provide a lot of feed for calves and you're going to do strip grazing and supplement, then I would go with pearl millet or sorghum Sudan. I like pearl millet if I want to graze before the killing frost. I think sorghum Sudan sometimes yields better than pearl millet, although I've seen some pearl millet that yields pretty doggone good.
Awesome. And there was another question series that you answered about like the other crops in this system or what can be in the system. Do you mind going over that with everyone?
Yeah, so one of the things I want to clarify is that I really kind of have multiple fields in the system, if that makes sense. So like what I would plant my, say my oats after, often for us is early harvested corn silage. Also might be something where we planted, say a warm season like sorghum Sudan or pearl millet and harvested it for hay or grazed it off and then come in and plant the oat rapeseed. And a different field would be coming out of, say, soybeans or corn, and we're actually planting into those. Oftentimes it's soybeans or corn silage, and then we plant the winter hardy into those. I really like late harvested corn silage to plant the winter hardy into because it needs some protection anyways. Might as well plant it. It's early enough. I get really great yields in the spring. And then often you're going to be going to something like soybeans, and soybeans are very forgiving with having those winter hardies in there in the spring, grazing them off. And then we really try to get off by May 15th if we're going to put in something like the soybeans. But if I was going to go with now, say, another forage crop, then I probably graze longer because the forage crop can be a little bit more forgiving on planting date. And I could go till July 15th, or not July 15th, excuse me, June 15th, and probably still graze up until that point.
Thank you. Zach, I have a couple questions for you. The first one is about sort of the purpose of the stock cropping system. Is it about selling the livestock more or getting nutrients back into the fields? And, with the scale that you're at now, sort of the question is, are you making enough from selling the animals alone for that to be the purpose, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so the answer to it is yes. The purpose is to sell the animals. The animals are the value coming off. And we really didn't know initially what that would look like, but the more that we got into this summer and did some evaluation on what we could market these for, where the pasture raised market, and we do think this is somewhat of a unique twist where this idea of kind of the self-feeding field to the live from the row crop right next door to the animal. I think that resonates with the consumers, and we can sell at a premium that can make this a viable business venture.
And did you have any issues? There was a question about like overheating, like any of us that have been in cornfields in the summer know that it gets pretty hot. So did you have any issues with animals overheating between corn rows?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we had a couple weeks of really hot weather, and one of the cool things, I talk about the cross leveraging of the system. When we got in the heat of the day and it was the middle of July and the corn was 10 feet tall, it actually created a really great shade window so that the animals could actually go out and sit in the shade of the corn, still be outside. And it was really fun to watch that, something we didn't think about when we drew it up. That's also why we didn't have the barn enclosed. We wanted good air movement, and we really didn't have any issues, with the heat, because we definitely had a dry hot period in Winnebago County this year.
And do you think you're going to play around with your spacing at all? There was a question about why not 12 rows and 30-foot spacing, or do you think you're pretty set on what you're doing right now?
Yeah, so I should have clarified that. The orientation we had this year was just predicated on the fact I have a 12-row planter, and we didn't know if we wanted to make the barn any wider than 20 foot. So I think if, when we actually scale this out, it will match. So it'd be 20 feet of row crop, 20 feet of barn, so that you would have a true rotation, or 30 foot. I'm contemplating doing a 30-foot version this year, but we've got to look at the weight and the engineering and the cost of changing that. So, but yeah, it would definitely need to match up once we scale this up beyond our prototype test.
And there's a couple questions about the watering system. Can you just go over that again for the animals?
Yeah, so this first year for the test, it was really easy to chore and water it. We had, to be honest, we had a hydrant that was within hose distance that we could hook up every day. But you could see in the design of the roof, we actually built it to take advantage of rainfall. So we had a center fill gutter system that would fill the water tanks when it rained. And that was really cool. It kind of stunk because it never wanted to rain this summer, but when it did happen, it was pretty neat to utilize that. If we were to scale this up, we would have to, come up with some sort of mobile vehicle that would come up from behind with feed and water that we could, simply pump quickly to chore the barn. So it'd be a combination of, choring and then utilizing the roof water as well throughout the summer.
Thanks. I'm going to switch it back to Mary real quick. Mary, there's a question here about aerial application of oat and rapeseed into a row crop field so that you can get good growth before grazing. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so my initial thought, like brassicas do really well interseeded as long as they can get light. And we've always thought oats didn't do well without good seed to soil contact. And I'll tell you, we've played a lot with trying to interseed a lot of species into corn ground, and it seems hit or miss, and a lot of times miss. And I will tell you, the best fields for it are the fields that don't do so well in terms of corn. But I will tell you, like in seed corn ground, we've had really great luck putting oats in interseeding when they take out the male rows, which I didn't think would work very well because I thought we'd need better seed to soil contact. So I think the big thing is probably about light interception. We're still trying to figure out what makes it sometimes work and what doesn't. Now, herbicides are another part of that story. So that's something that we're actively researching right now. It's kind of figuring out if you're trying to use it for forage, you kind of need to have a fairly low risk way, right? You need something that you know is going to provide forage when you need the forage. And right now we just don't have that for that interseeding.